Hi everybody, this is Anne. How many times have you gone into the pottery supply store and marveled at all the beautiful colors of commercial underglazes on the shelf, only to pass them by because you just didn't know what you could do with them? Well, today I'm going to show you 8 ways you can apply underglazes to your pottery. First, you can apply underglaze like you would if you were painting with watercolors or acrylic paints. In this example, I penciled on a design around my piece, then brushed on the underglazes with assorted sizes of fine art brushes and small fingernail painting brushes. If you want to find out more about how to paint butterflies and bees, check out the link above to the video Underglaze Painting 101. Next, I'll show you how to use these Sumi brushes to splatter underglaze on your pottery. Using Amico Intense Yellow Underglaze, I scooped a little bit out onto a small container. I added enough water just to thin it out a bit, but not so much that it's runny when splattered. It's a good idea to do a little test on paper before committing to your piece. Before applying any underglaze, always wipe down your piece to remove any clay dust and debris. Now I'll use the bigger Sumi brush to splatter this flat dish. I dipped the tip of the brush into the underglaze, then quickly flicked it onto the piece like this. You can also splatter underglaze onto curved pieces. For this mug, I took a piece of foam and covered it with newspaper, then laid the mug down on its side. I used the medium-sized Sumi brush this time. It took me a couple of flicks to get the underglaze flowing, but I finally got it going like I wanted. I then added the Amico Baby Blue to the yellow and mixed it up to get a nice chartreuse color. I flicked that over the yellow. Although I've been using the Sumi brushes, different brushes will yield different results. For instance, a toothbrush is very stiff and will result in tiny random splatters. Now here's what it looks like so far. Now I'll combine brushing with the splattering. I'll use the smallest Sumi brush, dipped in Amico Bright Red, to add some flowers to my abstract grassy field. Finally, for this design, I'll apply underglaze from a dispenser bottle. I'll squeeze the underglaze out of the tiny tip like so to complete the pattern. Here's the final design with all 3 techniques. The 4th way to apply underglaze is by sponging. First, I'll tape off the areas of the piece that I don't want sponged. I'm using both automotive detailing tape and electrical tape as the resist here. I decided to use a natural sponge for this because it has such an interesting texture. I dipped a section of the sponge into the chartreuse underglaze and pounced it on the table to remove any excess moisture. Then I began to sponge randomly over the mug. Be careful not to over-sponge or you'll lose the texture. Once the chartreuse was dry, I rinsed out the sponge and changed colors to the Amico Intense Yellow. I again sponged it on, being careful to leave some of the chartreuse showing. I then did the same thing with the bright red, followed by the electric blue. Again, I made sure all the underglaze was dry before peeling off the tape for the big reveal. It looks like white birch trees in a forest among fall leaves to me. You can also do sponging with a plain kitchen sponge. For this technique, I'll cut the sponge into a square shape like this. I'll then dip it into the red underglaze and sponge it over the surface on point. I then use the edge of the sponge dipped in the chartreuse underglaze to layer over the diamond shape. I top that off with black dots to come up with this harlequin design. Next, I'll show you a brilliant technique I saw demonstrated by Emily Burkhalter of the Call Us Timely YouTube channel. I'm using plain tissue paper cut to the size of the piece. I'm crinkling the paper up, but this step may not really matter in the end, as I'll show you. I'm using Amico Velour Black and a small sumi brush to apply an underglaze design to the paper. Use gentle strokes so the paper doesn't tear. Remember, the reverse of your design will be transferred, so if you're planning to add letters to the design, write them backwards. The wet paper is very vulnerable to tearing, so I used a heat gun to dry it completely before picking up the paper. As the transfer is stark black, I decided to add a little color to the piece before adding the transfer. Make sure the underglaze is completely dry before moving to the next step. I lay the dry transfer face down over the piece and using a wet sponge pounce it over the paper. This reactivates the underglaze so that it will transfer to the piece. Notice that the moisture acts to create the crinkles in the paper, so it may not matter if you wad the paper beforehand. Carefully lift the edge of the paper to see if the underglaze is transferred. If it has not, lay the edge back down and keep pouncing. Continue this until you're satisfied. I really like how the wrinkles in the paper show up to create an antique appearance. I did have to apply a little bit of underglaze with a brush to the corner of one of the flowers, but I really like how it turned out. Next, I'll show you a fun way to marble the underglaze using shaving foam, underglaze, and a bisqued pottery piece. I laid out a layer of shaving cream and gently ribbed it flat, but still fluffy. I then used a brush and splattered bright red underglaze onto the surface. I followed with the baby blue, the chartreuse, and the intense yellow. Then I took a small pointy stick and ran the stick through the foam to gently marble the colors. I I then put my bisque mug over the top of the foam and rolled it over the colors so that it picked up the top layer of foam like this. Then I ran it under the faucet to remove the foam. Now here's what I came up with. It was pretty, but I wanted to see if I could get more marbling on the surface. I still had a lot of cream left, so I reloaded it with underglaze, this time really marbling the heck out of the underglazes. Well, I succeeded in achieving a more marbled look. That is so cool. Now here they are after the bisque fire. Very festive. Next, I'll show you how to spray underglazes with an atomizer. For this piece, I started with bisque-fired pottery and vinyl decals printed out from a Cricut machine by my friend Debbie Schwartz Murphy. Thanks, Debbie! I peeled off the backing and then stuck it down where I wanted it. I really burnished it down before peeling off the front. Now, some of the little pieces didn't want to stick, but I was able to transfer them using a needle tool. I continued applying the decals all over the mug until I came up with this design. Now here's the atomizer I'll use to spray the underglazes with. Be sure to use this in a ventilated area. I poured the watery underglaze into the canister and replaced the lid. I gave it a little test first to make sure the underglaze didn't run when sprayed, then began to spray it over the decals. I made one pass over the surface. I then switched to the baby blue, stirring out the lumps, and did the same technique. I then did the same thing with the red underglaze, but just blasting that right over each flower. When all the underglaze was dry, I peeled off each little decal for the big reveal. Now here's what I came up with. Even if you use the same decals, every piece of pottery will look different every time. Remember that you don't have to use decals with this technique. Tape down stencils will work, or really anything that has holes in it. Finally, you can stamp the underglazes onto your pottery. There are a lot of really cool commercial stamps, but some had too fine details that wouldn't cleanly transfer. I tested a few and found that this butterfly worked well. Of the different ways I experimented with to apply the underglaze, the kitchen sponge worked the best. I picked up the underglaze with the edge of the sponge and gently wiped it onto the stamp, making sure it was well covered without any glops. I centered it where I wanted and pressed it down to the plate we had previously splattered. I still had little gloppiness in the center, but I think that adds to the charm and actually gives it a little movement. I thought it needed one more butterfly to complete the design. Now here's what I came up with. Looks like a little bit of the color fired out of the second butterfly at cone 04, but otherwise I really like it. You don't have to use commercial stamps. You can make your own using rubber printing blocks and a carving tool like this. The nibs can easily be switched out to make different size lines, and the rubber's very easy to work with. I asked Xiem to carve a stamp for this segment, and I should have known better than to ask him. Here's what he came up with. I should have reminded him to write his letters backwards because the transfer is in reverse. So he got to work and made a second one for me. This one's much better, I think. Here's another handmade stamp that we made for the 10 amazing ideas using a ribbed mat video. I can achieve all sorts of symmetrical patterns with these. If you want to learn how we made these stamps, click the link above. Here, Xiem demonstrated his handmade stamp. As you can see, the rubber stamps are flexible enough to apply onto curved surfaces. Hopefully, one of these cool ideas will be inspirational to get you to experiment with those brilliant underglaze colors. If you liked this video, we'd appreciate it if you'd like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time in the studio.